Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me. Make sure you are following and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and make sure to share this episode with your family and friends. We are about a week and a half out, 2 weeks out from the President Trump's electoral victory. Senate is now controlled by Republicans. The House will be controlled by Republicans. And I have a great guest coming on today. I have David Harsanyi coming on to talk about the rise of BlueAnon, how the Democrats became a party of conspiracy theorists. David, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad you could be here because it's funny. You always see the right being tagged as conspiracy theorists, the Republicans, and you have this media ecosystem that exists. But it's also government institutions as well, like the FBI, that talk about the right perpetuating conspiracy theories. However, in your book, you lay out a number of conspiracy theories that come from the left that largely get ignored. Can you provide an example of a conspiracy theory that is driven by the Democrats and why the media and the government doesn't even look or talk about them?
Well, I guess the first one would be the idea that only the right have conspiracy theories, right? So I think it's important just to mention that take Russia collusion. That was probably the most successful conspiracy theory in American political history. So the reason that was successful was because right-wingers, I'm not saying there aren't conspiracy theorists on the right, there are, but it's largely relegated to the fringe or, things like that. Whereas on the left, they took this Oppo file that was a conspiracy theory. They laundered it through media. They polished it up with production values. They got experts to say it was true. They then had the government agencies participating in it. So their conspiracy is like the Russia collusion conspiracy theory, I think is the most obvious and the most dramatic, are successful because they have all these institutions and this institutional power behind it to spread it. Now, I think things have changed a bit because no one believes what the media says anymore. So
Rightly so.
They can't really get away with that sort of thing. But, for people who are younger, I mean, just to think how dramatically things have changed from 20, 30 years ago when there was widespread trust in what the media was saying. Sure, they were biased, but you never thought they'd make something up from whole cloth. So yeah, I think Russia collusion is a big one. And, there are many others and they're more subtle. Like, for instance, the idea that minority votes are being suppressed. There's zero evidence that that's true. I'm not saying it doesn't ever happen in isolated cases, but as a systemic, kind of like policy, it doesn't happen. It's easier to vote now than ever. And yet if you poll people on the left, they'll tell you it's harder to vote than ever. So things like that, there are other specific.
That's such a good point. And it's so easily verifiable. I mean, we could just look at election data and see that the minority vote share has actually increased in the last several election cycles. So that's such a good point. And I love the meme that says, I need to find new conspiracy theories because all mine came true. Now, when we look at the government and the media and even big tech, one of the things that concerns me is the weaponization of misinformation and disinformation, how they use this as a tactic to play into broader narratives, to try and paint Republicans as crazy loons that just put false information out there. But it's used to silence dissent. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes Republicans are crazy, but no crazier than anyone else, I think. And the thing is that let's go back. You can go back. I mean, I write about this history in the book, but Hillary Clinton, when on Good Morning America, I think it was, or maybe the NBA, one of the morning shows, when her husband, when the Monica Lewinsky thing broke and spoke about the vast right-wing conspiracy. So the idea that there's this conspiracy against you, that there are misinformation or disinformation is undermining you, is itself kind of a weird inverted conspiracy theory, that everything anyone says the Hunter laptop thing, for instance. You had all these folks come out and say it was Russian disinformation. So they use that all the time to chill dissent, and they used it obviously widely during COVID and during the 2020 election. There was a concerted effort by the entire media, mass media, and giant tech companies and the people who worked in the government to silence, to not let people, to put doubt in people's mind about the Hunter Biden story, but also to censor it. Now, the New York Post did a great job on that story. All you can see from the beginning, they had sources on the record. They had physical evidence of their story. Everything was done perfectly. And just to show you how ridiculous that was, I think it was a few weeks before, a few weeks after, you had the Jeffrey Goldberg story about suckers and losers in France at the cemetery of Donald Trump that they had no on the record sources for. And yet everyone repeated that story. So it's very obvious how they use misinformation, disinformation, quote unquote, to chill speech or to spread their own conspiracies.
Yeah, the suckers and losers thing, that was a big deal. You even had the people that put their names on record, like people like John Bolton, who did not like Trump, said he never said that. We never heard him say that. And yet the media ran with it. They also ran with the Russian bounty story. And I think COVID, I really think that was a big one, because anything that people would put out that criticized Lord Fauci or anything that related to masking on children, social distancing, the Wuhan laboratory was labeled as misinformation. And we see misinformation this election cycle, right? I mean, in your book, you describe the idea of the left's fascination with the Handmaid's Tale, that we're one election away from women being oppressed, from going back to Afghanistan, right? That they're going to be relegated to just the society, and they're not going to have any say. They're not going to have any voice. And this is the narrative they push. But when you put that in contrast with the Republicans and policies, when you put it in contrast to the way people went out and actually voted, are people buying the media anymore? I mean, are they listening anymore? Or how is it projected to go?
Well, think about the Atlantic had the suckers and losers story, and this cycle they did the same thing. Now I can't remember what it was, but
Hitler,
Atlantic,
that he praised Hitler and Hitler's generals.
right? That he praised Hitler. Same author, probably the same people involved. Completely, no one cared about it. I mean, not no one cared, but left cared, and it was a big media story. But obviously, voters didn't believe that this guy had been president for 4 years and did nothing to them. Was going to be Hitler or cared about that. I do want to mention one thing about the misinformation, disinformation, and all the censorship. Now, we often argue, we say, well, actually, the Wuhan lab thing wasn't disinformation. There was legitimate evidence. It should have been discussed and debated. But even if it was, it still shouldn't be censored. Even if you're nuts and you think, you come up with some crazy conspiracy theory, we value open discussion, even if crazy people are involved, and we let them have their say in this country. That doesn't mean you have to platform people on your show, for instance, if they're crazy. But when you have an open, like a social media platform that's open to all kinds of speech, and you're just picking one or two people, and there's so much nuttiness on there, and you're just picking one or two people, that's, I think, wrong. And I just think it's, it undermines the values of free speech. But yeah, I think the media is not going to get any better. If you watch them after this election, I mean, it's the same conversation. It's not, they don't say, maybe we shouldn't have called Donald Trump Hitler. They're like, why did all these people vote for Hitler? They haven't like rethought their views on this at all from what I've seen. And, they'll get more ratings. Donald Trump brings ratings to people who hate him and love him. So, the incentives there are just to continue what you're doing, I think. And, so I don't think people will listen anymore, at least not independents and people who are persuadable. Obviously, Republicans haven't been listening for a while.
Well, the media is incapable of any type of self-reflection whatsoever. I mean, that is abundantly clear. They're actually criticizing Biden for not getting out of the race sooner. And I'm sitting there like, you conspired to cover up his cognitive decline for 4 years. And maybe if you actually reported on it, he wouldn't have ran for re-election. And you Democrats could have had a primary. But it really, you have to laugh at these people and the way they behave, the way they act, because they're still pushing it. In your book, you focus a lot on election and the idea of election denials. Now, you have done your research. This goes back long before the 2020 elections, and Democrats have a history of challenging elections. Can you explain that to the audience?
Yeah, I mean, election denialism is a very stupid phrase. Denialism is used to intimate something very nefarious, right? Holocaust denial is where you hear it the most. So, but if you go back to 2000, I think, I mean, listen, there's always been some people who, going back to elections since ancient Greece that will believe that something went on, that they couldn't lose and something must have gone on, something hinky, to undermine them. But if you go back to 2000, to this day, if you ask a Democrat who won that election, they will tell you that it was stolen from Bush. Despite there being independent, I think 3 independent recounts that actually showed Bush had won more votes in the end than had been counted. So that was the first election. People forget in 2004, there was widespread conspiracy theories about Diebold machines, about what had happened in Ohio and some other states. You had people in Congress talking about it. I lay it out in the book, but virtually every leader in the Democratic Party came up with, embraced that conspiracy in some way, to undermine the legitimacy of George Bush's second election. Then obviously in 2016, every single Democrat, from Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden, every major one said that it was not, that Donald Trump was not the legitimate president. Yeah, they didn't have a riot at the Capitol, but I think that 2016 was I hate to use the word coup because it usually, again, intimates some kind of violence, but I've never seen a president be undercut by, the administration and agencies in the way Donald Trump had. And that story took over our lives for like 3.5 years. And then when it was over and debunked, they just moved on. Everyone who participated in it got better jobs. There was no reckoning for it. No one was fired for it. No one apologized for it. And we just moved on like it was nothing. So, and then
and it caused enormous damage to our society. I mean, that 3.5, 4 years of the Russian collusion narrative and people undermining within the Trump administration. I mean, that really caused damage. But we're getting reports of that already taking place. I was just reading an article before this interview that you have military officials meeting behind the scenes to discuss President Trump's or President-elect Trump's orders once he gets into office and whether or not they're going to obey those orders. So what does that do to our political process? What does that do to the political system here in the United States?
Well, there's a huge problem. So many things that Donald Trump did that were completely normal, that every other president does, they treated like it was, the fascistic or something. And they're doing that now. I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, but the idea that Milley, for instance, could go before an election and tell Chicoms that he wasn't going to follow the president's order, to me, I don't understand how that's not sedition. Someone has to explain that to me. If you don't want to follow someone's orders in the administration, you quit, right? You don't have to follow orders that are unconstitutional. You can go to a whistleblower. That's when the media is important.
But according to the self-anointed guardians of democracy, like General Kelly and General Mattis, they said that they had to stay there because they had to be on the inside and make sure that they could undermine Trump from within.
Now, if they're undermining Trump because Trump is doing something that undermines the Constitution, I'm all for it. But that was not what was happening there. I mean, there's another thing with the election denialism. I think Trump lost, but the thing is, he has every right to take legal recourse to challenge results to make sure, he and everyone has a right to question an election. Today, Democrats are all over, plenty of Democrats are out there questioning this election as well, even though it was pretty overwhelming. And, they can do that to an extent. At some point, you either move on or you're a conspiracy theorist, right? So, once the facts are out there, there's this saying, I think it was Carl Sagan, you have to have an open mind about stuff, but not so open that your mind falls out of your head, and I think that's what happens a lot with partisanship, drives people to this excessive, it's almost a religious thing where they just have blind faith that their candidate should have won and they must have been cheating. But I don't, if January 6th hadn't happened, and I don't, Donald Trump didn't, raid the Congress or anything, then I think this whole, the whole Nazi thing, which is a conspiracy theory about how he, wouldn't have even had any traction anywhere. It's the only reason it did. And to me, that was a political riot. It wasn't like those people, they call it a violent coup. And this is why I don't like to use coup. It's not like the shaman, I forget his name, the guy with the Viking shaman guy, where he was going to like take over Congress and pass laws or take over the country. And people who get hysterical about that, and don't get me wrong, I think it was an ugly event, but if you get overly hysterical about that kind of stuff, you sound like a nut, and I think a lot of the Democrats did, and I think that's one of the reasons they lost, actually.
Absolutely. And listen, when it comes to the 2020 election, I mean, it's not unnatural to question something where the election rules were changed 8 months prior to an election because of COVID, where you had states that went into these, we're going to mail everyone a ballot and, just throw ballots everywhere. I mean, let's be honest here. The government can't even fix potholes correctly, yet we're supposed to pretend that they could change an entire system of voting in 8 months without any problems and it's going to be safe and secure. So I think there was room for questioning it. Now, when the results came in, all right, everyone has their own, disagreement on what took place and what didn't. But to me, it was more of the government saying, you are not allowed to question the narratives, because if you question the narratives, we are going to label you as conspiracy theorists, as you write. And one of the more frightening things was the Biden administration's 2021 National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, where it labels that anyone that criticizes, expresses anti-government, anti-authority sentiment has the potential to be a domestic violent extremist. So no longer are you conspiracy theorists. Now you have the potential to be a domestic violent extremist. What do you think of that?
Well, country is founded by, it's the same thing. They were spying on Catholic churches, Orthodox Catholics. This country was founded, I think it was P.J. Rocca said this country was founded on religious nuts with guns. And, the idea that you can't question authority in America is insane. That's the whole point of the American
Our existence.
Yeah, exactly. Now, that's why we have limited government. It's the only constitution that I believe in on earth that gives people, individuals, God-given rights that are protected, not given by the state. Obviously, most people know that. I don't think Democrats know that, but we do. And the idea that questioning those things makes you a terrorist. I mean, and a lot of it was cynical. Now, think about the protest of the school boards. I'm sure you know this too, where parents were upset about the COVID restrictions, but also about the woke DEI agendas and things like that, and they were labeled terrorists. And it was a complete cynical thing to do to try to chill speech. I just don't think government should be involved in speech at all. I don't even think they should talk about speech at all. I don't think there should be an FBI report about what people are saying or aren't saying makes them this or that. I just think we have a free speech right. And until we engage in any kind of violence, it's none of their business now, So I think that stuff you mentioned is just another way to chill speech and shut up the other side. We have a complete right to question an election if we want to. Now, I can call you a name and call you a conspiracy theorist if I want, but that doesn't change your right to speak about it. I think sometimes lately I notice there's this, people don't understand. They confuse the First Amendment. Like I don't, for instance, if someone is spreading a conspiracy theory, you have no right to shut them down. But I also have no duty to give them a platform or talk about them or treat them seriously if I don't want. And some people are like, every voice should be heard. No, we don't have pedophiles on TV because not every voice should be heard. Some voices need to be not heard. And I think that's fine as well. Forcing people to say something is also not free speech. And I don't think, you should have to do that if that makes any sense, on social media or so on. I do think, though, that we believe in the First Amendment because we believe in the principles. It's not just something that's written down and we're like, oh, now we have to follow this. Hopefully we believe in the principles under, girding that right. So that's why we let people speak. It doesn't mean we have to have like everyone. And
it's our job to question government. I mean, I constantly tell my students that the only way you can really hold government accountable is by asking, even if you agree with the policies and the people that are in power, you still question them. You question the policies, you question the motives to try and keep them honest. But in this day and age, it seems like you're not allowed to ask questions. And you have a lot of government officials that believe free speech is part of the problem. You have Richard Stengel, a former Obama official, that said free speech is a defect of the original Constitution. You have, you brought up the Atlantic before. So Jack Goldsmith and Andrew Keene, two professors, one's Harvard Law, one's at Arizona State University, saying that when it comes to restricting speech on the internet, China has gotten it right and the United States has gotten it wrong. So what do you do when there's so many in power that believe that free speech shouldn't be a God-given right, that we shouldn't be able to speak freely as a society and question the authorities in power?
I mean, the New York Times basically has a column every week saying the Constitution is wrong and we need to fix it. Whole long pieces about how the First Amendment is hurting America. I think the whole left is basically anti-free speech, and those who aren't anti-free speech have basically become like the Elon Musk types. These old kind of liberal types, true liberal types, are now on the right in many ways. So I don't know what happens. I think that probably signifies that our things are over, and in a way, and maybe it's just going to take a long time. I don't mean to be too dramatic, but if half the people don't believe in the founding document and don't want to follow that document, I don't know how a country can really survive in the way it has. I think even in the past, there was generally consensus that free speech was important and you don't limit any kind of free speech. So now the only properly functioning institution in America, the Supreme Court, is basically the only thing standing between Democrats in government doing all kinds of terrible things on speech, right? I mean, other than that, I don't know what would really stop them from censorship. And it hardly even stops them now. So I think that's big trouble. And I don't think it changes because a lot of our education, there is no civic education. We do, in a lot of
it's abysmal.
Yeah, so they're not teaching a young person, yeah, it's okay, hate speech is bad, but it's a neutral principle. We can't, government, whatever, how people believe in free speech understand that. And I don't think there's any of that. So I don't know how you fix that. It's going to take a long time. But we'll
I
see.
think you're right. And I think that's critical because people constantly ask me about the division within society. And I always respond with a follow-up question. Well, when were we ever unified? I mean, when it comes to politics in a free society, there's always going to be division. It's always an ugly process because it happens in the open. But the part where we were unified was we understood what it meant to be American. We understood what the American identity was, and we all unified around the Constitution. So I think you hit on something really important, that if half the country doesn't believe in the Constitution anymore, if half the country doesn't believe in the fundamental rights, we're on a dangerous path. And I want to ask you, now that we have a second Trump administration coming in, what do you anticipate is going to happen? Obviously, the second Trump administration is going in with their eyes wide open. They now know how the system works. They understand how they were undermined the last one. But what do you think is going to happen with the second Trump administration? Do you think that they're going to continue to undermine him? Do you think that we'll get some semblance of normalcy back, or it's just going to get worse?
I just quickly want to say you made such a vital point about politics. Everyone's always talking about we need to unify and unity. No, politics is specifically exists for a place not to unify unless we have some sort of national trauma or something like 9/11. But that's where we work out our differences. This idea that we have to unify is so authoritarian. I don't have to unify with people there. I unify in my community or in my life, but not there. And you're right. The anchor to that was the Constitution. Those are the things we believe in. This is the stuff we fight for. And it's changed. As for Trump, I think might be better for him in the sense that he's going to hopefully, listen, he put people in his administration, he kept firing them. That just creates instability. You need to have people who are on board with your agenda. He was elected by the American people. He should have he should surround himself with the people who are going to help him, with his agenda. And that's that. And institutions should be listening to him. He may have to fire people there, but I think it'll be a little bit better. I'm sure there'll be some pushback still. The other thing that I don't like, honestly, is how senators are now in like an arms race, to tell Trump how much they're going to support him. The Senate's job is not to do that. I hope that they're all Republicans.
Well, I always found that weird. Congress's role is to obstruct the president, regardless of what political party's in power or not. And all of a sudden, in this day and age, everyone says that Congress must capitulate to the agenda of any president that exists. It's always bizarre.
The Constitution doesn't have two political party system. It has a different system where the Senate is its own. It's supposed to listen. It can go along with the president, but I hope that conservative senators make sure they do hold the administration accountable to conservative ideals, but also to the Constitution. So one of the worst problems that's happened, and it really kind of happened with Bush, but I think it accelerated under Obama, is that the legislative branch simply hands everything over to the executive branch to do that's not supposed to be doing. And then when we have elections, we're talking about these people like they're kings and they can fix everything when they can and they shouldn't. So I don't think it's going to get better on that from seeing how everyone's sort of clamoring to tell Trump how much they support him, that's going to happen. There's nothing wrong with supporting the president of your party. I'm not saying that, but that shouldn't be your number one concern. Your number one concern should be the Senate, the Constitution first, and then the Senate as an institution. And it just sounds, and Democrats are no better. Chuck Schumer, was I remember him cheering on Biden's student loan, executive actions. He's in the Senate. He should be that should abhor him, right? But instead, he's championing the president. So no one really cares about their constitutional duty anymore, unfortunately.
Well, again, I think that goes back to the whole thing that civics education really isn't taught, that the House of Representatives represents the people of the United States. The Senate represents their states and is supposed to do what's in the best interest of their states. And the president represents all 50 states and the interests of the United States as a whole. People tend to forget that. But hopefully we could reignite civic education at some point. David, really appreciate you coming on. Everyone needs to check out the Rise of BlueAnon, how Democrats became a party of conspiracy theorists. We're going to have links up at the P.A.S. report website, pasreport.com. So everyone check it out. David, thanks for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at pasreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.